Getting the low end right truly is one of the biggest skills in electronic dance music. When your kick and bass isn't working together, it can sound terrible. But when you got it dialed in just right, it can absolutely rock the club. So today I'm going to introduce you to my new co-coach Nick DeGrace with over 10 years experience creating and teaching electronic dance music, and this is the most in-depth low-end tutorial you will find anywhere on the internet. So today we'll be covering the perfect sound you should use for your sub bass, how to fit it in the mix perfectly with everything else, how to layer it up for extra energy, as well as literally everything else you need to know about getting your sub bass to sound amazing in your track. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Nick to the EDM Tips team, and I'll hand you over to him now.
Thanks for the intro, Will. I've set up a step-by-step demo here on how to get your low end sounding big and consistent, how to add layers, and how to mix it for that really nice tight low end that doesn't overpower the other elements in your mix. All right, so step one of part one is choosing the right waveform. So the most common waveforms used are sine waves and triangle waves, with sine waves having a very smooth and clean bass sound, while triangle waves have a little bit of added character and warmth. And what I've loaded up here is operator, and I have chosen sine as our waveform. And you can see that represented in the oscillator tab here. And as I play this note, you can see with our spectrum analyzer that we are just playing a clean sine wave as our sub. If I change over to the triangle wave, you can see that there are some added partials here, or harmonics, and these ones are odd partials. And so the tone you're gonna get is a little more hollow, but a little warmer. For this example, I'm going to be using a sine wave because I want to start off with the cleanest bass possible. Step two is setting the pitch. So the pitch is going to depend on the key of your track. You usually want to aim for a frequency range between 40 Hertz and 100 Hertz. This will give your sub bass a solid foundation without overpowering the rest of your track. As you can see here, I'm going to go into the mini tab and I've chosen G sharp as our note. And if we look at our spectrum analyzer, you can see that we're sitting in a really nice frequency range for our sub bass. Specifically, the note of is at 51.9 Hertz. Step three, adding harmonics. This is a great way to get your sub to sound even bigger, get it to cut through the mix, and have it translate better on smaller speaker systems. This is usually done by adding distortion, saturation, or maybe even a combination of the two. But be careful to not overdo it, as this can quickly make your sub bass sound muddy and undefined. So I've grabbed Ableton stock saturator here, and I'm driving 15 dBs of gain into this thing, which is a lot. So I need to compensate for the massive volume change here by bringing down the output volume. And as you can see here, we have our sub hitting at negative 14 dBs. And as I increase the dry wet, which would be introducing the added saturation, we are not getting any volume change whatsoever. So all you're hearing is tonal change, which is great because you don't want your ears being fooled by something sounding a little louder and you think it sounds better when it just might not be. As I turn on the spectrum analyzer, you can see we have our sub here. And let's take a look at the waveform as I introduce the saturation. You can instantly see that there are harmonics being added in. And the way that the sub sounds now is we can hear it a little bit more than just being able to feel it. And this is great because this is what's going to allow your sub to cut through on smaller speaker systems. And depending on what shape of the saturation you choose is going to introduce different orders of harmonics. And so you're going to get different tonal changes. From pretty soft to just downright nasty. And this is where you can then blend to taste. And I really like to use analog clip because it sounds a little warmer and it's a little easier on the sine wave itself. So I am going to blend this, and I usually pick somewhere between 60 to 80 for my own personal taste because I really like to be able to hear the sub, but at the same time still be able to really feel the weight. All right, finally, EQing, step 4. We need to EQ our sub bass in order to make sure that it has its own pocket to live in inside your track. So you're gonna wanna cut out some of the unnecessary frequencies in the higher range. Sometimes the saturation can also add unwanted frequencies below the range of your fundamental. So it's okay to EQ those out with either a low shelf or a high pass filter. Okay, that's it for part 1, so let's move on to part 2, where we're going to be talking about layering. This is a great technique to use when you want to add more complexity to your bass line, and when done properly, it can really add that extra depth and energy to your mix. Step 1 of part 2 is choosing the right sounds. When layering your sub bass, you want to choose sounds that complement each other. This means selecting sounds that have different frequency ranges, characteristics that add to the fullness of your bass, and don't mask each other when they're playing together. So for this example, you could layer a sine wave with a sawtooth wave to add some grit and character, and you could also add more voices to the sawtooth wave and a little bit of detuning to get a nice stereo spread as well. Alright, so here I have loaded up a instance of Serum, and we are using a sawtooth wave as our waveform, and if I open up the spectrum analyzer here and play the note, you can see there is a lot of harmonic content that a sawtooth provides, and so that's going to be great because it's going to give us a great foundation on starting our layer for our sub bass that's going to have some nice stereo width and a lot of grit and a lot of texture. And so I'm going to start by adding some unison to this, and what this is going to do is give us a nice bit of stereo spread. Really nice, sounds like a sweet spot for me. I love the 7 unison oscillators, and then we can even go a step further by adding a second oscillator as well. And this one I've actually placed 2 octaves above so that it's higher in the frequency spectrum and filling out that area as well, and played together. Doesn't sound like much, but let's add some detune to it and unison. And now we're starting to kind of almost get that house kind of vibe, that house saw stack vibe. And so now I'm going to go into the effects section here because we want a little more grit and a little more stereo width and something that's going to make this sounding even more interesting. So I'm going to open up the distortion here, and I've got it with a bit of more drive. We're at 71%. Let's keep it at 70. And that's really bringing out some nice texture, some nice body. And now that we have that, I want to play around with the phase of that airy texture as well. So let's add some noise in here, and that's going to really fill out the top end. And if we go back into the effects section here and start adding some flanging and coursing, you're going to hear some phasing, some movement. Maybe a bit much. There we go. I think that's filling out the top end really nicely. And let's take it one step further by utilizing everything that Serum has to offer by messing with the mix knob a little bit here. I like the sense of space that that adds. And one extra thing that I've done here is I've macro knobbed the texture and the mix of this hyper section. And what that's going to do is that's going to enable us to add some even more movement, but really change the timbre of this. And that might be something that you could utilize later on if you're trying to get a little more creative with this down the line in your own song. So now that we have that, I want to solidify the frequency ranges of this a little more, just squash them down and make them sound nice and fat. So we're gonna add the classic OTT. And you see that's really bringing out a lot of top end, really can bring out the body. We can even add a little more of the mids if we want. And lastly, we're going to put a filter on this, and I've also mapped this to a macro knob so that we can have full control over the cutoff. You can even add a little more drive, a little more fat harmonics to this, and now we have more control over this as well, so that we can have this be more of a wide layer that adds a little bit of girth, a little bit of warmth to our sub bass. And maybe if you wanted to as well, we could add a little bit of reverb just to make it live in a space. So now that we have that, I want to bring this down. Possibly, we have our filter cutoff set to about 200 Hertz at the lowest point. And I think that sounds pretty good for how it is. So now let's bring in our sub bass and see how we can make those fit together. So here's just our sub bass on its own. And now here's with our added new textural layer. I'll bring the filter up a little bit. Ooh, and that's sounding nice and fat. There's one thing I would like to mention here is that this oscillator, the first oscillator, is in the frequency range that is below 100 Hertz. I want to keep it there because it sounds really nice. I like the texture that it gives. It's a little darker than having this be 1 octave higher. And this is subjective and up to you. But one thing that we can do in Serum here is we can go into the pencil tab and we click process, and they have an option here called remove fundamental. And what that's going to do is it's going to remove the fundamental partial of the saw wave. And now you still can have the nice darker texture, but you don't have the lowest fundamental of this saw wave messing with your sub bass. So here's how it sounds. And now you can have a nice textural layer that is not going to mess with the low end of your sub. Step 2 is level balancing. So once you've chosen your sound and or sounds, you need to balance the levels of each layer. So you want to make sure that each layer is audible but not overpowering. And a good rule of thumb is to have the sub bass layer at the forefront and your other layers providing support. So now that we have a nice consistent sub, we've got a nice layer that adds a little bit of stereo width and fullness to it and a nice texture. I want to have something that's filling out my top end, and that's going to be the kind of main focus of this track that I have here. So I found this loop. It's got some good groove to it. And that's what's going to be filling out the higher end of our frequency spectrum, while the mid bass that we have here, obviously filling out the mids, and then we have our low end sub that's just filling out all the meat and adding a lot of that weight to here. There's a little bit of a volume imbalance here so far. So what we're going to have to do is try and get everything sitting a little better. So let's get our lead. This needs to come down a bit. I think that's a little better. Maybe we will bring this up a tad. There we go. Let's turn the sub off. I think the sub's sitting exactly where it should be right now, and that's perfect. So without these two, nice and fat. All right, step 3, you already know what it is, EQ. So now that we have our layers balanced, we need to EQ them to make sure that they fit in the mix. So you want to make sure that each layer has its own space in the frequency spectrum, and this means cutting out any unnecessary frequencies and boosting the ones that complement each other. So now we have our sub bass, our mid layer, and our lead, and these are all sitting nicely volume-wise, but they aren't necessarily fitting nicely in terms of their frequencies because there is some overlap. And so what we're going to need to do is take some EQ in order to make them fit nicely together and make them sound like they are one whole instrument playing together. And so I've got an EQ on our mid layer. If we look at our sub bass, we're occupying up to about 120 hertz. And so I'm going to bring this to about 120 hertz. And that way that everything below that is being cut off. And there's a little bit of overlap still, but that is completely fine. We want that to add to a little bit of the body and make it still be able to fill everything out instead of cutting a little bit too much and then having this one pocket that it needs to be filled later on. And so we have that. And let's take a look at our lead. This is a little ugly because it's occupying the entire frequency spectrum, and that's not what we need. We only want to really occupy a little bit of the high mids and above. And so we're going to grab an EQ here, and we're bringing it behind the frequency spectrum, and we're going to start cutting, and we're going to cut so that we're just getting a little bit of that body and a little bit of texture. .400 seems to be a little bit of a sweet spot for me. And so now let's play our mid layer and our lead together. They seem to be working, but there's a little bit too much in the body that's still clashing. And I noticed that as I had it somewhere in between 600 and 800 hertz, that the throatiness of the lead just seemed to pop out. And so since I've cut that in the mid layer, I'm actually going to boost that here a little bit in the lead layer and really let that shine through. Tighten that up a little bit. And I think that's sounding pretty nice. And I actually want to get a little more of the air and the grittiness of this texture as well. Now that sounded really gritty, really nasty. Let's play it all together. So now each layer is filling out a specific part of the frequency spectrum and not clashing with each other, sounding really nice and full and gritty and fat. All right, so that's it for part 2. Let's move on to part 3 of mastering your low end, and I'm going to show you guys how to mix your sub for a nice tight low end. So we have a big consistent sub right now. We have a nice layer for fullness, character, and energy, and now we're going to need to find a place for that sub bass to sit in the mix, which I like to call finding the pocket. So let's dive right in. So the first step to getting a tight low end is balancing its volume with the rest of your mix. You want to make sure that your sub bass is audible but not overpowering. So a good way to do that is to use a reference track and compare it to your mix. So you want to bring your reference track down in volume to about the same relative loudness as your own track, and then take a low pass filter and bring that down from anywhere between 100 Hz to 150 Hz, and then see how yours compares in terms of perceived loudness. And that way you'll be able to have a nice benchmark as you continue mixing the other elements in your track. Also, using a spectrum analyzer can be a nice visual aid. All right, so I've finished off this loop here. I've just added a kick, some top loop percussion, and some effects just to make it seem like it's a more fully fleshed out track. I've added in my own reference track here, and I've balanced them roughly at the same perceived loudness, and that way it's going to give us a good indication of how much sub we are lacking, or maybe if we have too much. What I'm going to do here is I put an EQ on this, and I've low pass to 100 Hz, and I'm going to do the same thing on my master, but I'll show you the track here first, and then we're going to take a look at on our spectrum analyzer roughly where we're sitting, and we're going to use our ears as well. Nice and groovy. I like the housey stuff. And now let's take a look at our reference track. And I'm going to apply this filter now to our track as well. And so we can see on our spectrum analyzer that we're sitting roughly around -12, just peaking a little bit above. And let's take a look at our own track here with that solo off. And so you can see realistically these are the notes that are hitting. The ones that are peaking above are because of the kick being played on top of the sub bass right now. And so we got a little bit of room to go. We can bring up the sub bass just a little bit. So let's go into our sub channel and just increase the volume a little bit and see what that gets us. I want to be trying to hit roughly before -12 as well. And it seems that we can get just there, maybe -0.5, -1. We'll keep it at -1. And let's listen back to our reference. Yeah, roughly the same balance level now. And that is a great way to start, because if you have too much sub in your track before you even start getting into the mixing and mastering process, you're going to be making a lot of decisions based off of that imbalance. And that's just going to lead you down a rabbit hole and a ripple effect of not making the right balance choices or EQ moves in your mix. Step 2, side chaining. So to ensure that your sub bass and your kick drum don't clash in the mix, you're going to want to use sidechain compression. So this technique involves triggering a compressor on the sub bass with the kick drum. And what this does is it creates a pumping effect, which allows the kick drum to cut through the mix without being overpowered by the sub bass. You can do this with Ableton stock compressor, but I also like to use either Shaper Box 3 or Kickstart 2. All right, so now that we have a relative volume balance in our mix in terms of our sub and everything else, we need to get our kick punching through and playing really nicely with our kick, because the kick and bass relationship is so important in music, and if you don't have that, then there's nothing really driving the track. So let's get a sidechain compressor on our groups so that we can let that kick punch through and not have it fight with the bass. So the way I like to do that in Ableton is by using a separate channel as our sidechain trigger, and I use a short sample, and this is what that sample sounds like. And so now that I have that, that's what's going to be triggering our sidechain compression. So I'm going to grab Ableton's stock compressor here, and this arrow will open up the sidechain tab for you, and you turn that on. I have selected my sidechain trigger as the channel, and nothing is happening right now, but as I bring down the threshold, that kick starts to come through, and we start to get a pumping effect. This is too much, of course. And you want to get a decent rhythm pump going, but you don't want it to just overpower everything. So you want it to be somewhat transparent, but you really still want that kick to punch through. And so now that I have that set to a relative level that I like, I'm actually going to copy this over to my effects as well, because I like to let my kick punch through on everything, and I just want it to duck everything else and not have anything else fight with it. So I can be a little more heavy-handed with that. And now that we have our kick and our sub playing together, let's take a look back at our master channel and see what our levels are looking like, because before we were peaking over -12. So let's take a look here. As you can see now, that bump that we had there originally is gone, and we have a little bit of room to push the sub. So I'm gonna give us an extra little dB here. And that's starting to really feel like it's nice and full. The kick and bass are playing well together. And that is a great way to be able to lock in that kick and bass relationship. As a pro tip, if you want to have more individual control over your sidechain, you can have a multi-band sidechain. And I've actually created one in Ableton already. And the way I like to set this one is with using multi-band dynamics. And so I've soloed the high end by creating multiple bands. I've grouped these together. And so here as well, I have soloed the mid band, and on the low band, I've soloed the low band. And I've created some crossover points that I can use a macro knob and just delegate where I want each frequency crossover to be. And then I've macroed the dry wet. So I'm going to close that out so that we can forget about it. And then I set my sidechain trigger on each band. And now I can solo each band. And I have individual control over a certain, whatever frequency I set the cutoff to. So for myself, I do like to keep it at 150, and then I can see the mid band, and I'm actually going a little easier on the mid band. And then on the high band, we can go a little bit later. And so what this does is it allows your sidechain to be really transparent. That kick is cutting through the other elements. The body of the mix and the high end isn't really getting pumped too hard. It'll help you achieve something really nice and clean within the other elements in your mix without having your kick just overpower everything. Okay, step 3, mono versus stereo. So in most cases, we want to keep our sub bass in mono, and this is because the low frequencies can create phase issues when in stereo. So that can result in a really weak and inconsistent low end, and we obviously don't want that. So you can use a stereo widener on the higher frequencies of your bass line, but keep the sub bass in mono. All right, finally, step 4, EQing. The last little bit of EQ that I would like to do is going to be on the master channel. And that's because I still feel like there is a little bit of low mud on the sides that I would like to clean up. And what that's going to do is it's going to make our bass feel a little more tight, a little more defined, and it's going to let our high end on the sides shine a little brighter and sparkle a little bit, because now we don't have that low end eating up all that headroom and muffling things. So the way that we do that is by utilizing mid-side EQ. And so I have Ableton stock EQ here, and if you click this tab, you can select MS, which stands for mid-side mode. And so now I have individual control over the mono signal and individual control over the side signal or the side channel. And what I want to do is I want to grab this high pass filter, and I'm going to start to bring it up until I feel like that mud is gone. So let's play the track. That's a little too much. And I find that the sweet spot for myself is anywhere between 90 and 200 hertz, because you get to decide ultimately how warm something sounds on the sides. But I usually end up finding my own sweet spot somewhere in between 150 and 120 hertz. So I think 135 is great, and we're gonna leave it there. If there's one last added little bit of sparkle that we can do is maybe adding a bit of a shelf here to the high end. go. Bass is sounding nice and tight and focused while our high end is nice and bright. And I'm going to open up Ozone just to grab the imager here and solo our low end so that we can see the difference that we are making. So you see this is our low end currently. We're sitting at 135 Hertz and it's nice and focused in the middle. If I take the EQ off, you can see it's a little more phasey, a little more dancey, if you want to call it that. And this just tightens it up nicely so that now we have a really nice and defined low end in the middle where all the punch and all the power is. And we can let our side information just sparkle and shine bright and sound really nice and big. And that's it. All right, so that's it for mastering your low end. So we've covered how to mix your sub bass using volume balancing, mono versus stereo, saturation and distortion, using sidechain compression, and doing some final EQ moves. And by following these tips, you'll be able to create a really solid low end for your track every time. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys again in the next video.
A massive thanks and welcome again to Nick for putting together such an awesome video, and let us know, did you find this useful? If so, which part of it was particularly new to you? This is the kind of detail we go into in the Accelerator program each and every week, where we help our students get signed to some of the world's biggest labels and make truly professional sounding dance music. If you want to work with us, you can check out the details below. Now, getting your sub bass dialed in is really important, but how do you pick the right bass sound in the first place? Well, I put together the ultimate guide on that in this video here. It's going to help you pick just the right bass for your track and genre, and then I'm going to show you how to pick the perfect kick drum to work with it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you over at that next video.